to read the poem that he wrote about the Gary Lineker shenanigans.
Thank you. So some of you who follow me on Facebook know that I do what I call kind of spiritual political ditties from time to time, and this is what I wrote on the day of the match, as it were, or the day after the day of the match. Assault on Lineker. I don't like football and I don't watch Match of the Day, but a nutmeg is a nutmeg. Truthful words that roll straight between the legs of a person who doesn't know what to do. I don't like the cult of fame. I don't listen to what most of them say. But holding up the mirror is holding up the mirror. And if a celebrity asks leaders to reconsider their thinking, the only consideration is the nature of the way they say it, not the saying in itself. I don't like politicians. And I don't like the distrust and often blatant lies onto screens and newspapers that assault our ears and eyes. An assault on Lineker is an assault on a national treasure. When thought for the day ignores the majority of our thought, when politicians mislead and lie and people simply walk on by, when it seems fine to deliver a line of offence in defence of borders, but not in defence of those crossing them. So now let's take our leaders' measure. Ignoring laws and changing laws to deflect and to deny protest. An assault on Lineker is just one of the many reasons we should be pissed. I support truth, hope, love and integrity, not lies, shame, blame and depravity. A Match of the Day theme tune is one that plays for everyone.
Thank you, Mark. I invite Patrick to share his reflections with us now, please.
Thank you very much, Laura. I am getting these warnings that my internet connection is not good. So, Tony, could you indicate if you can't hear me well enough, okay, by waving or something, just so that I know that I'm coming through to people. First of all, I want to declare an interest in this topic, not around freedom of speech, but because I'm born and brought up in Leicester, just like Gary Lineker. And he is someone who is extremely well known in Leicester, sometimes referred to, I think tongue-in-cheek, as Saint Gary. I think there are some people who use that term about him positively, as in he was this great player and he was never booked in his career, which is quite something for a footballer, an international footballer. So he does have this kind of clean image, but also some people maybe like to take a bit of a dig at him about, oh, he's so good, he's so good, he's so right on about things. So Saint Gary can cut both ways. You can be called Saint Gary for a good reason, or it can be a bit of an attack line as well. My granddad used to work on the buses in Leicester, and after he'd been on the buses, he would go to the market to pick up some fruit and veg. And one of the stalls on Leicester Market was Lineker's, which was run by Gary Lineker's father. And Gary Lineker himself would sometimes serve on the stall on Leicester Market, selling the fruit and veg. So again, he's a well-known person, and he's come through a place where a lot of people have known him and his family and all about them. So when it comes to like a freedom of speech, there is also an element of whether you know someone or whether you don't in the way you can communicate. And a lot of people, say in Leicester, may feel they know who Gary Lineker is, not just from him being a footballer, but they kind of know his family, they know the connections and they know the context. And I feel this is very relevant in relation to how we see and communicate with each other. Because if you don't know people at all, if you hide behind anonymity, if you just throw out tweets which are just aggressive and critical, and there is no actual connection between you. You're just like attacking, bombarding, and fighting with one another. And in this case, we have somebody here, Gary Lineker, where people know his hinterland, where he's from. And of course, the other thing also is, if I was at home now, I would be online in my house, which is a quarter of a mile from the Walker's Crisps factory, which is the other thing which you may know Gary Lineker is famous for, which is his crisp advertising. This plays into whether he's allowed to comment on things, because of course he has a profile, doesn't he? So Gary Lineker is somebody that was a footballer. He's somebody that's on Match of the Day. He's somebody that does advertising for brands on TV. All those things mean his profile is high. Should he be allowed to say whatever on these platforms, say on the BBC? That was the question. And the biggest question of all really was pressure put on the BBC to discipline him, if not to take him off air, but certainly to put pressure on him not to be able to give his views. And the argument, of course, was said with the BBC, well, the news presenters and the current affairs presenters, they don't have to reveal what their political views are. They must not do so. But Gary Lineker was a sports presenter. But I think people still thought it was a way of shutting him up. And why did they want to shut him up? Because, as Marcus said, he wasn't saying things which were favourable towards the government. And if you think about that, if you think of somebody from the government contacting the BBC and saying, oh, we don't like what he's saying, can we find a way to close him down? Or just generally put the wind up him or try to intimidate people, you can see Gary Lineker's in a very strong position. He's not a BBC employee, he has freedom. But what if somebody else wasn't in the same position as Gary Lineker, wasn't able to stand up? They could be silenced and they could be told, oh no, you can't give your views because they're not acceptable. It brings us round to the old issue around freedom of speech, that people are very happy to endorse freedom of speech for people who agree with them. And sometimes they are less keen to endorse freedom of speech when people disagree with them. The other issue which I'd like to mention is about online and social media. You know, recently, Mike Atherton has commented on the situation with Michael Vaughan and racism at Yorkshire Cricket Club. And Michael Atherton wrote, future historians will look back on this as reflecting a particular time when the culture wars held sway, when social discourse was vicious, when there was a desire to prosecute rather than communicate, and when there was an inability to see through the divisions and recognize that situations can be complex and nuanced. The internet is young. We are not really conversant with the effects of how we communicate with each other. But I leave you with two thoughts. First is from the Anne Frank house in Amsterdam. When you've been through that house and seen where they holed up and hid from the Nazis, there is a statement in the room and it says, one person's freedom begins where another person's freedom ends. We may think that is about physical freedom, but maybe there is something also there about the way we express ourselves and communicate with each other. And the very final point to say is to reflect on, really, under what circumstances, if ever, are we justified in saying to someone, you can't say that? Under what circumstances, if ever, are we justified in saying that? You can't say that. Those are my thoughts about Gary Lineker and freedom of speech and Walker's Crisps and fruit and veg.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much. Lots of food for thought there. And we're going to open up the discussion to the whole group, but first I'll I'm going to quiz Mark a little bit about some of the issues around this.
Okay.
So Patrick touched on pressure being put on the BBC possibly to close Gary Lineker down. So who do you think, Mark, who do you think has a problem with the BBC in our society?
Well, that's a good question, isn't it? So there's a number of different, I was going to use the word factions, that's probably the wrong word, but there's several sets of people in my view. I think politicians of both the left and the right in significant numbers have been critical of the BBC's neutrality for as long as I can remember understanding what politicians were saying about the BBC, which in my case, coming from a political household, was probably about the age of 12 when I used to hear my father complaining as a Tory that the BBC was biased. So that's been going on for a long time from both left and the right wing of politics. I think that it's accelerated over the last 5 to 10 years, that there is a definitive move perhaps amongst politicians of both sides that there's a sense that they might not like to see the BBC, and that's certainly said explicitly by some. But we've also got other categories, haven't we? We've got those who refuse to pay the license at all because they don't think they should pay a tax for something that they don't want, but almost certainly continue to benefit from the BBC services in some way, because we pretty much all do one way and another. And we've also got those that rail and then say, I'm now not going to pay me tax for a specific reason. So we've got those that are kind of refuse out of an anarchy kind of reason. But we've also got a set of people who are refusing because no, we need to not do the BBC. Now, I don't know how many people that is, but it's a lot, isn't it? It's a lot.
Do you think an independent broadcasting organisation is actually relevant to us these days?
So what you mean relevant to us as a country, do you mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't really watched BBC television much for the last 10 to 15 years, although I am back watching iPlayer for a number of reasons right now. But I've always paid my license fee because I've always listened to the radio. So if you take World Service as an example, it's a worldwide culturally known event, not without critics, by the way. So it's part of our place. One of the main criticisms of that might be it's awfully colonial and white supremacist, is one of the criticisms about it. But I think I'm in Joni Mitchell territory here. We don't really know what we've got till it's gone, you know, and actually the United Kingdom without a free BBC, I think would be a much poorer place.
Do you think there's anything that's culturally spiritual about the BBC?
Culturally spiritual. Well, that, let me just see if I can find it. That reminds me of yeah, sorry, I'm just on my notes. This is a prayer by Stephen Schick, one that I often use, called Action Matters. And you asking me that question has brought this prayer to mind, because the BBC prompts us with lots of stuff, not least of which is educating us to understand the world and try and make the world a better place. I believe that the BBC does that. Obviously, I'll be interested to hear whether you all agree, but I believe it will. I'll just read this short prayer, perhaps have a minute of silence, and then I'll continue my answer. Spirit of life, God of love, how long can we live with the pain of not knowing what to do? How long will we use the complexity as an excuse to do nothing? When will we stop letting analysis and cynicism paralyze and demoralize us? What knowledge must we gain to do what needs to be done? We turn the future into needless suffering from our inaction. Eternal Spirit of hope, from time to time you present us with someone who speaks a simple truth. People who have food, shelter, and healing medicine must learn to share. That is all. God of love, guide us to the knowledge that moves our inert hands to action. Show us how to use them to build a future of hope. And those words came to mind in response to that question, because I'm pretty sure most of the country don't view the BBC in a spiritual way at all. And I guess we shouldn't really expect them to. But if it does provide a bedrock of education and information, it does highlight things that are wrong in the world with some of the fantastic programs that it's run for years. And it reminds us that basic point, you know, we must learn to share. We must learn to be open to understand the world. And I say, yes, it has a culturally spiritual place in our society.
Do you not think, with the world becoming so cynical now, the people start to assume that the BBC is the mouthpiece of the government? And the only way for that to be disproved is for the BBC to fight back and assert its independence. The problem when it does that, the government kicks back and threatens its funding. But I feel its role is to assert its independence, even though it's put under threat because of it.
Thank you, Tony.
I've lived and worked in Iraq and in Saudi Arabia, where there is no freedom of speech. Basically, you get the party line. It's like 1984, and working with people that they had to be very careful what they said, and they'd only talk to you if there was just one-on-one. They wouldn't, if there was a group, they'd fear that maybe one of that group would snitch on them and they'd be in trouble. And that's the other end of the stick, isn't it? And if we don't have this independent broadcaster, if we don't have an independent press, at least some of the press independent, we're going to fall into this sort of Russian type of publicity.
Thank you. Rose, did you want to say something?
I'd like to read this. Sorry, Rose, do you want to speak?
Shall I go first very quickly?
Fine.
What just reminded me of a few things really, and it casts me back a couple of decades actually, the whole freedom of speech thing. And I agree 100% what Tony's saying, that the BBC should assert its independence. And I do think they're actually terrified of the plug being pulled at the moment by this government really, and the threat of it being privatised, etc. But I think on the other thing around Gary Lineker, I think it was quite sad that it took a celebrity to highlight some of the injustices that we're seeing in the world. And then I went on to think over the week about the tweet or the something on Facebook that the Labour Party put up, accusing Rishi Sunak of not locking up sex offenders. And it probably was a bit near the knuckle, but I think it goes back to setting the boundaries. The BBC should set the boundaries with the people who they employ, or, you know, and so should government really. But it also reminded me, I don't know whether anybody remembers this, and I think what reminded me of the Children's Society publicity around child sexual abuse years ago. And I think it's that thing about sexual abuse of children that is just so shocking that people just don't want to contemplate it. And that's one of the things, I think, one of the reasons why we got such a reaction. But I'm going to finish now. But the Children's Society put up the poster saying, why go to Thailand when you can come to Manchester, implying that, you know, sexual abuse was going on under our noses, really. And the Children's Society, funded in part by the Church of England, they got the funding pulled, or some of it anyway. So I just thought it was a whole bag of issues that just very complex, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Ros.
I saw this quote this week, and it was while I was thinking about this meeting that I thought about it, and I'll just send you a few sentences. Learning what is and isn't right action is the job of a lifetime. Real answers, true ones, have to come from within. Rules can guide us, especially when we're young, but not all the way. Even if we think a lot about what rules mean, why they exist, that only takes us so far. Rules are made out of words, and of course we know words can be used either way. Words are signposts pointing at the rules, but they're not it itself. And the most important thing is rules move and change. And sometimes we need to be the movers and changers to make the rules change. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda.
Patrick touched on Twitter and social media, where people can be really abusive and hide behind a shield, and that is not communicating at all. And I read somewhere that people have said with the coming of the internet, people have actually forgotten how to communicate, because communication is about dialogue. It's not about throwing abuse from behind a wall.
Thank you, Tony. Andrew.
Yeah, I liked Amanda's point, and it just reminded me that certain things are acceptable in society at certain times. Like in Britain, there was slavery. This was quite acceptable, and the people who owned slaves, they thought it was integral to their business model, etc., etc. But people argued, and there was a sort of toing and froing, and eventually people thought that no, it wasn't a good idea, and in fact Britain started to dismantle the slave trade. So in a similar way, different issues come about, we need to discuss, and sometimes, as Amanda said, we change tack. For example, with the environment, you know, one time people used to think coal mine, you know, this is part of the trade union movement with NUM and so on, and now we're thinking more on renewable energy, for example. So the opinions change, but it does take a bit of free dialogue, surely, to argue the points, because we can't, you know, dictate always, you know, because we're not a dictatorship like some countries are. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Mark.
Yeah, I quite like to bring us back to one of Patrick's questions right at the end, which hits really hard on one of our key words of tolerance. You know, when can we say that you can't say that is a great question, because we profess and proudly so that we're a tolerant faith, but when can we say that you can't say that? You know, certainly, you know, I had a lot that piece that I read out at the start. I had a lot of likes and positive comments and messages about it, but I also had two very negative ones saying I shouldn't have said it. Any answers? Suresh?
Can I speak?
Please do.
Number of things. it is shocking to hear what Rod's saying. Why go to Bangkok when the facilities are available in UK? I think it's shocking. This is the very thing I was talking with Indra only a couple of days ago. Why many Brits go to Thailand, not to bow to Buddha, but for sexual gratification, or I don't know the right word, but you know what I mean, yeah. And that's very shameful. That's very, very sad. We call ourselves a modern, democratic, value-based country, and yet somewhere along the line we have gone wrong. In my opinion, BBC really stands for Biased Broadcasting Corporation. It's heavily biased. And like Tony, I think, mentioned earlier, you have the freedom as long as you stay within that limit, that how we define the freedom. And that's very sad thing, because it's not good for nations' mental and spiritual health if you're going to define that. What happened, Laura, many years ago, I was a BBC listener, because that's the only thing I knew, yeah, back from India, right? Then when I was listening to certain news, Mark, it didn't make sense. Although I'm not expert on anything, but it doesn't sink in, yeah? So I thought there's got to be some other way of establishing the truth or the fact, yeah? I then went through the channels and I came across Al Jazeera channel, which I think is broadcast from Qatar or somewhere, yeah? Now I regularly listen to both of them to get a more balanced view of what the reality is. And it is very sad that you can't really trust BBC, who is supposed to be independent of government jurisdiction, funded by the taxpayer, whether you like. And I commend you, Mark, that you are paying it, although you're not watching it, but you morally feel obliged to pay because you listen to BBC radio or something you said, yeah? So I think it is the right thing. That is dharma. That is following, the truth. That is following the righteousness. And that's a very sad thing that, we have to balance the book as against Al Jazeera or any other corporation. Now, I'm not saying that BBC reporters deliberately do it all the time, but they come from a particular perspective and they're going to see it the way they see it. Indeed, I'll finish it with one thing. I was at an interfaith conference in Birmingham, because I'm in Birmingham. And it came to reporting, by the way, yeah, how the interfaith conferences should be reported in the media and things like that. I said the best person to report any interfaith activity is a non-believer, because believer will always have some bias, even with the best intention. I'm not accusing anybody, but you got to, because that's the only thing you know. So I said, and obviously it didn't go down very well with the church people when I said non-believer, because non-believer has no extra ground with anybody. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Suresh.
I think my next ditty is going to be called Biased Broadcasting Corporation. Suresh.
No, you can't, because that's copyright. I have patented it.
Amanda, you're muted.
Sorry. This is absolutely wonderful. It's the Guardian's own inspection into its history and how it was built on slavery. This is a very in-depth magazine from lots of different perspectives, lots of different racial and ethnic viewpoints on it, and what it has meant to our society now, and how they are owning up to the fact that they found out that the money came from people who dealt in slavery. It's a very brave thing, and it does mean that we can listen and learn and change. It's hard reading, because a lot of it is, you think, my God, did that really happen? And there are things in this world now that we're saying, are they really happening? And what we need to do is learn to research and communicate like these people are doing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. That reminds me as well that the Hibbert Trust, which is a Unitarian trust fund, which is also built on money through enslaved people, has also been through a similar process, and they're publishing their findings about the origins of it. As you say, it's brave, but it's necessary. I think necessary work. Thank you.
Just one thing, if I can add what Amanda said a minute ago about racial something, yeah. From spiritual perspective, human soul is neither male nor female, neither black nor white, neither Indian nor American. We all have the same thing. There is no special oxygen supply line for white people or church people or non-believer. We all share the same. So we need to. In fact, I was very uncomfortable. I'll tell you the truth. I could be wrong. Yeah. But when I came to AGM and when I saw about that ethnic meeting or something, for black and colored people, there was some special session like that. I personally don't believe it. We all are human beings. We all share the same spirit. There's only one oxygen supply. Why differentiate on any ground? Male, female, LGBT, white, Hindus, Muslims? Utter nonsense. We need to raise above all those human limitations.
Yes.
Anyway, Gary Lineker. Would I be okay asking you a question, Patrick?
Yes, sure.
So this was just really to do with the tweets themselves. I don't mean the specific tweet that caused the problem, but the fact that Gary has, I think, got quite a long history, hasn't he, of making social commentary tweets. Have I got that right? And that he does.
Yes. Yeah.
And he goes to the edge quite often. It's not the first time that he's done that. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, and he is engaged with people. He's quite engaged with people who oppose him. He doesn't just block them. He does engage with people, and he gets a lot of criticism. Gary Lineker, for example, he gets attacks for kind of being soft on things, for being soft on immigration or soft on these points. But he's had people, asylum seekers, living with him in his house. He has people living with him. And so he does actually put his money where his mouth is, as it were, or put his situation. He lives it. He doesn't just talk about, how he's sympathetic to people. He actually supports them and has people living with him, which some people are impressed by and others get really furious about.
Thank you. And that's kind of a statement, the two loudest voices that I think I heard in the aftermath of this event was those that were saying that the BBC needs to be closed down, and those that our celebrities should shut up. We didn't hear the voice that you just volunteered to us then, Patrick, very, very loudly at all, that actually he was not only speaking on behalf of people, but actually did, as the Stephen Schick prayer invited us to do something to offer hope.
I'll just make a very quick point about the fact that it was impressive how his colleagues stood up with him and said, I don't like the way he's being treated, and I believe that what he said was true. And they could have just not done anything, but they didn't. They stood up with him. I think that was quite an impressive thing. And I just wish more people would stand up and be with their friends and say, actually, I agree with that, and I think something needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, that was one of the most heartwarming things about it to me, was the solidarity that his colleagues showed him. And I remember when it all blew up, that I was doing 2 services that Sunday in Unitarian churches, and at both, I did candles of joy and concern at both services. People got up and lit a candle for solidarity and talked about how important it was. Yeah, thank you for reminding us about that.
It's the power of the press as well to influence people. Down at my golf club, we sit around a table after a game, and there's one guy in particular who is he's a retired painter and decorator, and he gets onto this, what I call Daily Mail talk about the asylum seekers and putting them up in hotels and all this business. And I start a conversation with someone else about, I start saying, you know, you can't get a good painter and decorator these days. They all cheat, they all water the paint, and go on and on about it. And then he takes great exception to this. And but I say, that's just what you're doing to people who are trying to find a new life. But I do it every time, but he's not persuaded. That's the tragedy, really, isn't it?
Well done, Tony. You never know. One of those little nuggets just might get through. Might get through.
So yeah, no, Tony, you're absolutely right. People just some people just look at a situation just from one point of view, and it's only when they're in the hot seat that actually you know, they can then see from both sides. And so I used to have an uncle who's passed away now, but he was quite left-wing communist. So he used to say, oh, you know, if drugs go to America, so what, this, that. But then his daughter moved to America, and then his tune changed. He doesn't want drugs anymore. You know, we're wondering, why has your tune changed? But because he's now sitting on the other side, you see, he wants to protect his daughter who's in America. And so, so like that. So in conversations, I often try to, as Tony does, just introduce the other side of the spectrum, and then person can perhaps contemplate. Thanks.
Thank you, Indra.
I like to share some personal experience or my encounter with BBC. Because I'm heavily involved with Interfaith Network in Birmingham, representing Hindu perspective. And there are many times they have a program and they want people from different faith background to give their views. You know what they do, Laura? Blimey, clever they are. So, you know, the BBC, you know, the person who is going to sort out all the people, who is going to speak, he or she will ring everybody. Yeah. And Mark, she will ask you for your views on that thing. Yeah. And obviously you give your views, whatever, you know, otherwise your voice don't carry the weight. Yeah. And that happened about 5-6 times. I said, that is very strange. On 560 program, I wasn't invited. Yeah. But what they do, they cipher out the views that is not in line with what they want to broadcast. I mean, I can't be bloody wrong on all the things. Come on. You know, I'm not an expert on anything, but I can't be wrong on all the things, yeah? But I notice that systematically they weed out the people who do not fall in line with how they want to present the program. And that's a very sad thing.
Thank you. We're coming up to 8 o'clock. So does anybody have any last thoughts before we have our closing words?
Well, I'll just tell them.
Sorry.
No, go Suresh. Go Suresh.
I think we all can complain and moan about what BBC or any other media people do it, yeah? But that is not going to change the things unless people who are open-minded, who use the Vivek Buddhi or power of discrimination, follow the virtues, get into the position where the decisions are made.
Thank you.
You got to be in a position of influence where you can make the decision. Now, it might not go your way, but it can certainly influence from getting out of there altogether.
The good news, Suresh, is MPs are terrified of their postbags. That the more you write to them, the more they're influenced, because every letter could be a vote lost.
Of course.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure my
Good point, Tony. Good point.
I'm sure my MP is heartily sick of me writing to them. Mark, did you have something you wanted to say before we?
Well, I don't know, but it's just a little thing that happened. So where I am, I'm currently living in my motorhome on a caravan site, and I quite like it because it's kind of communal living without communal living. So we do gather around a table and natter when we feel like it, and we had a little exchange in the aftermath of the Gary Lineker thing. Between two white blokes, you'll not be surprised to hear with this one. One of them saying, well, all these people coming over just taking our jobs. The classic statement. Mm-hmm. And before I had chance to object to it, the other one traipsed in, say, well, at least they're bloody prepared to work instead of that lot who just want to take benefits. And, in the space of 30 seconds, you had that full array, which fits into Patrick's category. Well, can you actually say that? And I actually use the phrase, if I'm honest, I don't think either of you can actually phrase what you've just said in that way. And we then went into a conversation about it. But I do think that has been, the truth of this event with Gary Lineker is he said something very strongly that certain people seem to think he shouldn't be allowed to say. But I'm glad he did. I might not be glad totally about the way he did it, but I'm glad he did. And I really like the phrase that was said at the start. The BBC needs to get more assertive, and it needs to hold its place and demonstrate to Suresh in particular that it doesn't need to be the Bias Broadcasting Corporation, that it can actually be an organisation that's worthy of the name.
I think BBC has a lot to offer. That's absolutely right. It's a worldwide, it's a credible, it's a big history, it's part of a huge audience, and I think it's failing itself, and that's a very sad thing. Good discussion.
I'd like to just offer the end of the words of the prayer from Stephen Schick again, if I may, Laura. I don't know whether you've got any other closing words, but just to remind us, I find them very powerful in the context of what it would be lovely if we all felt the BBC contributed. God of love, guide us to the knowledge that moves our inert hands to action. Show us how to use them to build a future of hope.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.